Welcome back, everybody. So we're going to move into our next session on flowing techniques. So as you know, flowing is the weird word that we use for taking notes in a debate round. And it's one of the most important things you can master to make sure that you're able to answer all of your opponent's arguments and have successful debate rounds. And so I already told you how awesome Quinn is, but we are joined by Quinn Seremet this morning, who actually represented the DUDL at the Urban Debate National Championship a couple of times and was a very successful debater at the University of Denver. And we're very excited that they're sharing their time with us this morning so we can learn more about flowing. So if you have any questions, of course, you can turn your mic on, turn your video on, type something in the chat, and let us know. Otherwise, thank you to Quinn.
All right, just checking since this is my first time doing this. Is everybody able to see my PowerPoint? Did I set that up correctly?
It looks great.
Okay, cool. Great, fantastic. Then we will go ahead and get started. Like Jessica mentioned, my name is Quinn. I debated for a really long time. If you have any questions, feel free to just shout them out, put them in the chat. I'll have the chat window open. But we are going to go ahead and get started. So just for a quick overview of today, we're going to go over kind of the general structure of the flow. Hopefully this is something that everybody's already familiar with. It's still something that's good to review just in case. We're going to talk about how to organize your flow sheets, speech organization, how a good flow can help you deliver some really fantastic speeches, and then just some general tips and tricks that I have found useful over the years. Before I get started, is there anything specific that anybody would like me to touch on today? Okay. If something comes up, feel free to throw it in the chat. I'll check that pretty often. I have it open right now. Feel free to ask anything, but we're just going to go ahead and get started then. As we work through this lecture, I am using the civil forfeitures, AF and NEG from Berkeley for most of my examples. I have some other pictures of some flows that I have taken from judging this year. But if you want to follow along at home, you can find this file on Open Evidence. Open Evidence should be something that you're already acquainted with at this point in the season, but if not, just Google Open Evidence. Really great resource for finding lots and lots of files that you can use to debate this year. Additionally, I generally find myself to be most successful at flowing when I have more than one piece of paper available. So I like to have at least one piece of paper for my side and one piece of paper for the other side. Ideally, you will have more than that. I also like to use 3 colors of writing utensils. I prefer pen. Generally, I find that pencil doesn't work too well. It smudges. And I don't generally recommend flowing on a laptop or some other electronic mechanism of flowing. I find that if I'm also having all of my speech documents up, there are just too many windows going on. I lose track of what's happening, and it's easier for me to have some sort of tactile element that I can reference when I'm debating. If you don't have these things, no worries. We're just taking notes today. We're having fun. It's just a lecture. No pressure. So general structure, when we talk about flowing, there are 3 important bits of information that we must write down. The first is the tag, which in this card is democracy depends on economic freedom. It's more important than rights like the First Amendment. The second is the author, and the third is the date. So Dunkelberg 18 is how I would read that. You have to read the source and the date every time so that your judge and the other people in the round know that you're not just pulling this information out of thin air. How I would write this, because democracy depends on economic freedom, it's more important than rights like the First Amendment, is really long and clunky. That takes a lot of time to write down, and time is a really precious resource in the middle of a policy round, I would write this as short as possible. So you can see it right here as democracy, depends on economic freedom greater than First Amendment, and then the full author and the date. So I have it on the left typed out, and then on the right, you can see that it is actually the second card in the economic freedom advantage from the civil forfeitures affirmative. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to assume that you're...
One question.
Oh, yes, hi.
Hi. I really like how you have the names of the speeches at the top of your flow sheet and you're organizing it in columns. Is that something you usually do before the debate round, or how do you usually go about organizing your sheet that way?
Yeah. That is a great question. So for me, what I do kind of depends on what side I'm on in the debate. So if I'm affirmative, then I usually go into the round with the 1AC pre-flowed, because either, regardless of whether my partner or I are delivering the 1AC, I already know all of the content that's going to be in there. So I take, that downtime in between rounds or even before the tournament to just write out like 2 or 3 copies, depending on how many rounds that you're going to have, 2 or 3 copies of the 1AC on a flow sheet, and then it's just ready to go. And that way you can kind of brainstorm like, what would I like to run in the 2AC? What are some questions that I want to be sure to ask the 1NC, et cetera, et cetera. If I'm negative, obviously I don't have access to their entire case before the round starts, but I do have access to their 1AC as soon as the round starts. So in that case, I would spend the first part of the speech flowing all of the information, trying to keep track of like specific details in the cards, but also just skimming to read through the cards. And then in general, I don't usually write out all of the speech names before I start the round. I wrote it out in this case because I thought it might be helpful for people to see kind of how I set it up. So I do the constructives and then the negative block and then all of the rebuttal speeches. In this case, I accidentally wrote all of my headings too close together. So you'll see later on in this lecture that I end up overlapping my columns a little bit, but 110% would recommend flowing in columns. And then if possible, I like to flow on a vertical sheet of paper and not on a horizontal sheet of paper. I just find that that gives me more room to flow out the entirety of an argument, and I don't get cramped up at the bottom of the sheet of paper. But of course, that's totally up to personal preference. Really depends on what you as a debater want. So yeah, so you can set up some parts of this before the round. A lot of it is going to be set up kind of like in the beginning part of each speech, especially if you are doing a complete roadmap, and we'll get to that a little later in the lecture about road mapping and signposting, etc. If you were wondering where to find all of this information, it is in the speech document. So a really easy way to make sure that you have a great flow is to set up an email chain before the round starts. So as you are kind of like asking the judge for paradigms, blah, 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 make sure that you exchange emails with everybody else in the round. The judge may or may not ask to be included on that evidence chain, but this way you send out your speech before you start actually speaking, and everybody has access to the evidence. This is the same way that we would do it if we were debating in person. Back in the day when we had all paper, you could actually like stand up next to the podium and take a piece of paper as soon as somebody was done speaking to make sure that you had the proper tag, source, and any other relevant information that you wanted. Then we moved on to flash drives, and now we're on to email, which is so much faster. 100% recommend. But that will all look up, that will all show in this format where you have the tag, the date, and then the content of the card. Yes, so moving on to organizing the flow. In an ideal world, each argument should have a separate piece of paper. So that means that you should have one flow for inherency, one flow for harms, one flow for solvency, one flow for each DA, one flow for, every T argument. But in the interest of saving the planet, and also because that's just a lot of pieces of paper, it is also acceptable to flow the entirety of the 1AC together to create an AF flow, and then group like negative arguments. So if the negative is running multiple T arguments, I tend to flow all of those T arguments on the same sheet. And then if they move on to disadvantages, then I will flow a disadvantage on its own sheet. If they're running a counterplan with that disadvantage, then I will put that counterplan on the same sheet as that DA, because that forms a chunk of a full negative case. Generally, I do not recommend flowing on the front and the back of the same piece of paper. I find that gets a little too messy, but if you're really in a pinch and you just need to write something down, obviously you just got to find whatever works for you. It is, however, really, really critical that you keep all of the arguments separate in some way, either by giving them different headings or labeling them in a way that makes sense to you, so that when you go back in the rebuttal speeches, specifically the second rebuttal speeches, you can give a really clear and concise line-by-line analysis of each argument. So you want to make sure, you want to set yourself up for success in the beginning by clearly delineating each argument on your flow, so that at the end of the round, you can come back and say, okay, looking at the inherency flow, this is what we said, this is what they said, this is why we win. Moving on to the harms flow, this is what we said, this is what they said, this is why we win, et cetera, et cetera. You always want to be able to give that really concise, we said this, they said this, here's why we win analysis. And having a flow that is separated by arguments makes it really, really easy to do that. So for example, we can see here from the civil forfeitures affirmative, I chose the Congress 1AC for this example. We have an economic freedom advantage, an inequality advantage, the plan, and then solvency. And then I have added in my 1NC responses, which I would write kind of like as I was listening to the 1AC. But those are flowed directly next to the card that they're responding to. And if I was the 1NC, I would stand up and say, the order will be economic freedom, then inequality, then solvency, something like that. And then I would move on to my off case maybe. That's another discussion about negative strategy. But yes, so here we can see that each argument has its own individual heading. And so the 1AC is all flowed together. Here is another example of a flow from a different debate. Here is an example of kind of what not to do when you're flowing. Here I was flowing horizontally because I didn't want to tear sheets out of my notebook. I was flowing on my bed at this point because I was judging in my pajamas, etc. And you can see here that the flow for the counterplan and the DA get pretty cramped because there's not enough room for me at the bottom. Additionally, it's very confusing visually for me as I'm trying to review this round to have topicality on top of what was later announced as a counterplan and then the politics DA, right? So if I was going to redo this flow, I would have topicality on its own separate sheet, and then I would put the counterplan on another separate sheet. In this round, the politics DA was actually read in the 2NC, and so that, again, got kind of messy. In an ideal world, the CP and the DA would be kind of stacked on top of each other, not right next to each other, so that my extensions, all of these silly arrows all over the place, don't run through key arguments. Thanks, Jessica. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, cool. If any come up, feel free to drop them in the chat. We are going to talk a little bit about all of the abbreviations. This doesn't look quite like English at first, but every debater has their own specific shorthand, and that just allows you to listen at the same time as you're writing things down, as you're planning out your next argument, et cetera, et cetera. So shifting gears a little bit to talk about speech organization and why having a beautiful flow will really help you have fantastic speeches. So first and foremost, the top-down most important thing that you can do to have a clear speech for your judges, for your partner, and for your opponents is to signpost. Signposting is the key to making your speech easy to follow, and a speech that is easy to follow lends to a clear debate, which elevates the quality of your debate so that you're not bogged down in questions about like, well, what did you say? And like, what was the tag for this, blah, blah, blah. Instead, you can really focus on the meat of the debate and kind of the more academic focuses rather than clarification questions. So when I talk about signposting, what I mean is giving each card a number or a letter if you're in the 1AC or the 1NC. So if you're reading your 1AC, you can have inherency A, inherency B, inherency C. So that would be like A, tag, author, card, B, tag, author, card, C, tag, author, card. And then 1NC shells, which are the pre-written arguments like the DA shell, CP shell, critique shell, those will also come usually labeled with a letter. I don't usually recommend using numbers. That gets a little confusing, especially if your cards have a lot of data in them, or if you have a card that lists out, for example, like 5 reasons why policing reform is necessary, right? That gets confusing if you're like, okay, but you're on the second card, but you have these 5 reasons within the card. So I really recommend using letters. And then for subsequent speeches where you don't have those pre-written shells, break up your cards using a signal word like and or next. That way, even if you're using like your very best tag voice, it makes it super duper clear for everybody in the round that you're moving on from speeding through evidence to clearly reading a new tagline. And that way we all get to write down your tag. We all know that you've moved on to a new tag. And it doesn't come as a surprise when like, oh, wait, did they just say a source? Like, what was the tag to that card, et cetera, et cetera. This is also kind of a matter of preference. I would also recommend doing an underview. It is up to you whether you want to do the underview after each argument or at the end of your speech. But this is a really great way to kind of sum up everything. You can even write your underview on your flow so that you don't forget it. But it just gives a summary of the argument where you're like, okay, this DA says that this is happening now. This is what will happen if the AF goes ahead. And this is the bad thing that'll happen if you vote for the affirmative. And then you can move on. So underviews are really a matter of personal preference. Not everybody likes them. Not everybody has to do them. But I generally find that, you know, even if you don't do them in the constructives, they can be really helpful in the rebuttal speeches to make sure that everybody has like an ironclad idea of what your case is saying. So underviews, a little controversial, but I like to do them even just to write them down so that even if I don't say them, then at least I know really clearly what my argument is about. Extending cards. So this is where the rubber really meets the road for signposting. As a technical matter of debating in policy rounds, you have to clearly extend cards for them to be considered after a negative block. It is generally not sufficient to say, extend my inherency. Like you can say that, but then I would heavily recommend saying, extend my inherency, specifically the A and B cards, something like that. So that, you know, I as a judge know like, okay, you're gonna loop back to these cards later. So you can extend either by the letter, if you're working off of the 1AC or a 1NC shell. So as we see here, we have, extend my inherency A and B, solvency B and D, etc. Or you can extend by the source. So for inherency, extend Washington 18, Obama 16, and Franklin 19. For solvency, extend blah, blah, blah. And so this helps make sure that your cards stay in the running in the debate. And you can draw a little arrow to make sure that you know that those cards have been extended successfully. You don't have to reread the same card that you've already read. You can just say, extend this card, and move on. Additionally, you can cross-apply cards. So if you are, let's say you're the 2AC, and you're responding to the 1NC. The 1NC has said some stuff that you already read answers to in your 1AC. You knew that they would say some of these things. You can say cross-apply my Vasquez 5 card. So that would be the C card for the economic freedom advantage. Cross-apply my Vasquez 5 card to respond to their Dunkelberg 18 card. We can also see here that the 1NC has cross-applied the Emory 20 card, which says you must have integration with bankruptcy courts to gain solvency, to respond to the inequality advantage. So you can do it within the same speech. If you're in the constructives, you can say, I read this card up here. It also applies down here. Cross-apply it to this flow. Or you can do it across speeches, right? Like my partner read this card. It responds to this thing that we said. Cross-apply it here. And so that is a really great way to make sure that you're really getting the most bang for your buck with your cards. You don't have to search for a new card to say something that you've already said. You can just say, cross-apply this card, just as a reminder, Judge. It said this. We already addressed this matter. Moving on to something that I would rather talk about. And that really speeds up the debate for everybody. Any questions about extending and cross-applying cards? Okay, cool. So,
actually, Quinn, could you just talk just a little bit more? I think we have mostly like totally brand new or very novice debaters this morning. Talk a little bit more about extending cards and why that's important. I know you touched on it, but maybe just a little bit more.
Yes, yeah. So, so extending cards is important because first off, you don't have to repeat yourself. This is why it's important for you and your partner to both keep really good flows. I know that it's tempting for partnerships to say, okay, well, my partner flows and I come up with the arguments, right? It's important for both you and your partner to keep good flows so that you know what your partner has said and also what the other debaters in the round have said. Extending cards is when you take a card that your partner has already read and you apply it to something that the other side has said. So in this case, we have our Vasquez 05 card, which says that economic freedom is key to democracy and the rule of law. That was the third card read in the 1AC. The 1NC got up and said that there are alternate causes to economic freedom. So democracy is not the, or like, sorry, that there are alternate causes to economic freedom. Democracy is not the only thing that is key to economic freedom, and economic freedom is not dependent solely on democracy. And then the 2AC, which I know the headings are a little off. I got a little narrow. But the 2AC says, hey, we already addressed this. Like, there might be alternate causes according to Dunkelberg, but we have this other author, Vasquez, who says that economic freedom is key to democracy, right? Different ways of saying the same thing, but then you can just basically say, okay, even if they have a card from the same author, Dunkelberg 18, that negates what we say. we still have another card from another person who says what we want, like what we want to say. And so this saves a lot of time. The judge already has it on their flow, and it really clarifies the debate because now you don't have to spend, 30 seconds to a whole minute reading a brand new card. You can just say, I already did that, moving on. Additionally, as we can see here, sorry for the photo cropping, the second solvency card was by Brandon 19, and that can be pulled extended from solvency all the way up to the economic freedom argument, or the economic freedom advantage. So you can extend cards from different arguments to apply to, I'm sorry, I'm tripping over my words here, but you can pull things from solvency to talk about economic freedom advantage, to say like, okay, we laid out all of these harms for you in our 1AC. You did a lot of work in the 1NC to tell us why, maybe our harms aren't as big as we think they are, or there are alternate causes for why these harms happen, or you can't solve because you have to integrate bankruptcy courts. Then the 2AC can get up and say, actually, if you read our Brandon 19 card, it says that Congress has the power to do this. And so Congress could definitely incorporate bankruptcy courts as well. We didn't specifically say that in our plan, but that's definitely under the purview of Congress. So just cross-apply our Brandon 19 card. We can totally integrate bankruptcy courts as well. Done deal. We already addressed this in the 1AC, so your 1NC attack kind of falls flat. Kind of a linguistic distinction between extending and cross-applying. I don't know how finicky people are about this in the real world, but generally extending happens across speeches. Cross-applying happens within speeches. So we can see in our 1NC, for example, we read Emory 20, must integrate bankruptcy courts, Emory 20, as a response to economic freedom. Then we got down to the inequality advantage. Our 1NC was going just in the order that the case was presented by the AF. So first economic freedom, then inequality. We cross-applied Emory 20 to the inequality advantage to say, the AF is focused on policing, but really you have to integrate bankruptcy courts in order to gain solvency. And then moving on to our solvency responses, cross-apply our Lampert 19 card from the inequality advantage response, which says basically like the status quo solves. And again, cross-apply our Emory 20 card, which says, even if the status quo is solving, you still have to integrate bankruptcy courts. So there I have responded to all three of the affirmative arguments using one card, which really kind of speeds up the round. And it gives you a lot more time to move on to things that you would rather talk about, such as maybe a DA that you really like, or maybe there is a disadvantage and a counter plan that you would like to present together. So you can get all of your case attacks out of the way super quick, bing, bang, boom, and then you can move on to your off-case attacks if that's how you prefer to structure your negative strategy. Okay, cool. Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, so, wow, I am just zooming through this. Sorry, if anybody needs me to slow down, I still have the policy talking bug, I guess. So if you need me to slow down, I can definitely slow down a little bit, but we're gonna move on to some tips and tricks for speeding up your flow. Because as we can see here on this example of a flow, I don't write every single word down. I don't write the full words down, except for the authors. So we're going to talk first about abbreviations. Every debater has their own custom shorthand. So if we end a little early because I didn't plan an in-depth interactive session, I would strongly recommend going to YouTube, looking up some high school policy rounds. I think that there is a high school in Hawaii, the last time I checked, that films a lot of their rounds. Look up some of their rounds you can adjust the speed, play around with trying to write some of those down. If jumping right into a video seems like too much, feel free to just open up the affirmative. Maybe your affirmative, maybe the affirmative that we've been working with here, the civil forfeitures affirmative. I'm happy to attach this PowerPoint to an email of some sort. You can compare your abbreviations to my abbreviations, whatever you want to do, but it's definitely something that takes a little bit of time to work up into. So play around with what's fastest for you and your partner. When I did debate, we did it all in person. So having shorthand that was intelligible for both me and my partner was really big. If I'm thinking that probably none of you really meet up in person, but you probably are still typing messages to each other. Play around with some abbreviations that might work better for typing, etc., etc. Here is a small list of some common abbreviations. These are ones that I use most commonly. Some of them I think are pretty common sense. Some of them maybe not. But it really does come down to personal preference. You just have to figure out something that works for you, because if you're writing every single word down every time, you're never going to have time to come up with your own arguments. So abbreviations for arguments. I'm sure that we've heard some of these before, but basically inherency becomes INH, so that would be the first 3 letters. Harms, just an H. When I'm writing these out as section headers, I like to underline them. So H underlined would tell me that this is like the harms section of our stock issues case. Solvency, the first 4 letters. And then we have DA, CP, T, so disadvantage, counterplan, topicality. Critique becomes the K. Theory can be TH. Sometimes it's also abbreviated as just T. I don't see many theory debates in this league, so I wouldn't worry too much about that one. But speaking of case structuring, a lot of people are moving on to advantages instead of inherency, harm, solvency. So the advantage is basically inherency and harms packed together. And then you can move on to another advantage, which is inherency and harms packed together. And then at the end of it, you move on to your solvency, which solves for all of the advantages that you've brought up. So in our example that we've been working with, we have an economic freedom advantage, an inequality advantage, and then our solvency tells us how the plan can solve for the harms presented in both of those advantages. Speaking of common words, we have the USFG, which I'm sure we've seen in the resolution. The president, kind of up to you on how you write that one down. I think on this page, probably some of the more important ones are like change. I like to write as a delta, which you may have encountered in your math class or a science class of some sort. And then impact, couldn't figure out how to do this one on the PowerPoint, but impact I usually write as an exclamation point inside of a circle. And that saves me a lot of time with writing things down. So moving, we'll see an example of some of these abbreviations on the next slide. But before we get there, here is my case for 3 colors, aka why pretty flows matter. The reason why you want to flow in multiple colors is so that it is really, really easy to see what your side is saying and what the other side is saying. That, I think, is what we are traditionally introduced to with flowing. You have maybe blue for your side and red for the other side, or even black and blue if those are the ballpoint pens that are available to you. I would argue that it is also important to have one more color to make notes for yourself. If you get higher up in debating and it seems like you don't need that distinction, you always know what you're talking about, awesome. I am so jealous of those skills. I would love to know what I'm talking about at all times. But sometimes in the heat of the round, I'm writing things down and then I look back at those notes, I'm up at the podium, I totally fumble. So if I have these things color-coded, then it makes it really easy for me to tell, like, here are things that my partner or I have said out loud. Here are things that the other side has said out loud. And then finally, here are things in a color that I can scribble notes to myself. So if I'm working down the flow, I have a lot of arguments I need to get to, I can write, 1, 2, 3 to help me prioritize which cards or which arguments I'm going to talk about. I can underline arguments to bring up to the judge to say, hey, judge, this seems a little whack. Or I can make notes about what my partner has said that I need to emphasize in the next speech, or I can emphasize things on my partner's flow. For example, we have this flow. And so in this round, the affirmative was black. I flowed the affirmative in black. The negative was purple. And then I used orange to make my own notes. These notes probably are not going to look like what your notes will look like, because these were my notes for judging, which is why there are notes like new in the 2NR, et cetera, et cetera. But I can circle cards. I can put brackets around things that I'd like to bring up to the debaters at the end of the round. And I can also group cards. So when you're extending cards, like we mentioned several slides ago, you can extend them in groups. So extend my inherency cards, extend my blah, 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 right? So, or extend, I don't know, let's say Taylor 13, Raising 19, and Chung 18 in this round. I could draw a big bracket around all of those and just pull them through to the next speech. And so that's where a lot of these arrows are coming from, is the debaters were specifically talking about, they were talking in response to cards, they were extending cards, they were pulling through various arguments, or as we get over towards the right side of the flow, when they were doing some of their analytical arguments without evidence towards the end of the round, I can pull through kind of like that card, write down their bullet point of what they were saying, and then that way I know kind of like, here's how the debate siphoned down to these final couple of points. But yeah, so that is why I would have 3 colors. And let's see, yeah, so that is the end of our slideshow. That went really quickly. Are there any questions from anybody? We can spend the last, I don't know, maybe 5 or so minutes just chit-chatting. I don't have a specific interactive thing planned, because I think that flows are something that you really have to come up with on your own, but I would be happy to, work with you guys later. I don't know. You can email me a picture of your flow. I'll give you advice, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, any questions from anybody at this point? Cool.
So, Quinn, what would happen if you didn't flow a debate at all? Have you ever encountered a debater who just doesn't flow at all?
Yeah, so this is actually part of why I asked Jillian to let me teach a lecture, because there are a lot of debaters that don't flow at all. What I would say to them is, even with all of this advice that I've given you, if you take nothing else away, some bad flowing is better than no flowing at all. It is okay if you look down at your flow and you're like, oh man, I only have a couple bullet points. Like, I have no idea what the debate is about. False. You have a couple bullet points. You have a small idea of what the debate is about, and you've been listening, and you've been tracking what's going on, and you've been writing some of it down. That is fantastic. Please do that. Debaters who don't flow don't know what the debate is about. So generally what I see from debaters who don't flow is they only talk about their own material. They have very limited recognition of what their partner has said, which is frustrating, because you're supposed to be a partnership. You're supposed to be on the same page. If it doesn't happen, that's okay. We all have troubles with our partners, but ideally you want to be on the same page, present a united front. And then typically the third issue that debaters who don't flow have is that they really only remember buzzwords from the other side's arguments. So there's not a good grasp of what the other side is saying, cross-ex generally becomes a question of, I heard you say this buzzword, what were you talking about? And so cross-ex also does not become a very productive exercise. So even if you're only writing down like bullet points, you're not following any of the other advice I give you, at least write something down. That would be my big takeaway. Obviously, it's going to take a long time to work up to being able to flow really naturally. I debated in the DUDL for 5 years, 5.5 years, something like that. And then I debated in college for 4 years. So that's that's part of why I have really fantastic flows, is that I have been involved in debate for coming up on 10 years now. So like, just make sure that you're working on it. It's something that you have to practice. Definitely would recommend just, practicing getting down those abbreviations, getting more comfortable with the debate lingo, walk yourself through your AF case, write down your 1AC, and then as a practice exercise, flow a 1NC to it. Go through the neg file for your AF. Think of like, what would I say to this AF if I was the neg? Flow your 1NC. Do the same thing for the 2AC, et cetera, et cetera. You can flow out an entire round for yourself. And that's a good, really low pressure way to practice, like, okay, how would I do this without kind of the time pressure, without my partner depending on me? And I guarantee you it'll make your next round go so much smoother. Any other questions, concerns, comments, good jokes?
I have no jokes.
Okay.
No, that was really helpful. So thank you so much.